Hey everyone, Nick Raboy here. In this tutorial, we're going to see how to get started with service workers using Workbox, and then how they are relevant when it comes to progressive web application design, so PWA. So a few things that we're going to explore in this topic, and why we should even be using service workers, or what is a progressive web application. So first of all, I guess I'll take it back a step. A progressive web application is an offline first application. It's built typically using modern web technologies, so JavaScript, CSS, HTML. It can interact with native host APIs, so whether that be desktop APIs or mobile APIs, things like that. Just a whole kind of experience built with the web. We're going to be focusing on the caching aspect of things. So this is going to be the offline first approach. And we're going to be using Workbox because when it comes to native service workers, doing them by hand, there's a lot to take into consideration. You have to worry about clearing your cache, updating your service worker, making sure that things can actually update correctly. Workbox just makes that a whole lot easier. So it's a separate framework that makes your life just a little bit easier, and that's why we're going to use it. So we're going to see this by example. I'm going to show you some tips and tricks, and it will let you rank better when it comes to various Google audits. It'll give your users a better experience. So before we even get into the Workbox side of things, let's go ahead and create a new project. I'm going to create it on my desktop, and this is just going to be a very simple web application. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say make directory. I'm going to say PWA. I'm going to call it example project. I'm going to navigate into it. And I'm going to create a few files. So again, this is going to be a very basic web application. So what you would expect in a web application is you'll probably have some kind of HTML file. So this is going to be an index.html file. We also might have some styles, so some CSS, and we might also have some scripts, so JavaScript. Now, the touch command, all that's doing is it's creating a new file for me. Go ahead and make those files however you feel comfortable. Doesn't really matter. And we're going to be expanding upon this as we go. And you'll notice that I'm using a lot of very basic techniques. The idea is not to create a very complex project. It's going to show you how to use service workers and how to use Workbox. So let's go ahead and open up this project. I'm going to use Visual Studio Code. You can use whatever you feel most comfortable with. You'll see that I do have the project files open here on the left. I'm just going to open those in new tabs. I'm going to hide the Explorer window on the left, so that way we get a little more screen real estate. I'm also going to open up a terminal, so that way you can see the terminal directly within Visual Studio Code, although we're not going to be using too much of it for this particular tutorial. All right, so the first step, let's go ahead and populate some of these files. These are the files that we're going to be exploring for caching and things like that. Let's go ahead and start with the scripts file because this is going to be probably the most basic. We're going to say console.log, and we're going to say hello world. Pretty basic JavaScript file. The goal here is not to show what's inside this JavaScript file, it's the fact that there is a JavaScript file, so that way we can cache it later on. We're also going to add some styles. So we're going to say body, we're just going to say margin, maybe a 0, so that way there's no margin on the body. We're going to use a very basic h1 tag. Let's go ahead and say that there's margin 0 on this as well. Nothing too complicated, again, just like the scripts file. Then we're going to navigate into the index.html file. This is where we're going to bring everything together. And then we're going to start just looking at the Chrome inspector tools and things like that. So I'm going to say doc type. I'm going to say HTML. I'm going to say in the head, this is where we include the CSS file. So we're going to say link. It's going to be relationship, or it's going to be style sheet. We're going to say href equals styles.css because that's what we've called it. Outside of the head, we have a body, and we're going to include that script. So we're going to say script, we're going to say source equals, and we're going to say scripts.js for JavaScript. Now, just to show that we actually have stuff on the screen, we're going to say div, and we're going to say maybe h1, and we're going to say hello world again. And we're going to save it. Now, if I go ahead and open this, I'm going to open this in my web browser. I'm going to say open. I'm going to say index.html. It's going to open. It's going to say hello world up at the top. It's using the file system URI. We're going to change that because when it comes to service workers, we can't really use the file system URI. we have to be serving it. And when it comes to that, we have either the option of hosting it or we could run some kind of local development server. So we could be using Python, Caddy, whatever other locally running kind of deployment tools that you have, ngrok. There's so many to list. So what we're going to do, I am using a Mac. If you're using Mac, Linux, even Windows, as long as you have Python installed, you can run a local server. So let's go ahead and clear that. Let's go ahead and say Python-m simple HTTP server, and I'm going to have it serve on port 8001. Serving on port 8001. I'm going to go back into my web browser. I'm going to say localhost port 8001. And as you can see, it is still saying hello world. So far, so good. Now, let's go ahead and look at our Chrome inspector. So you can say Command Option J, or you can go into, I think, maybe how you get there manually, somewhere around here, maybe View Developer, and then JavaScript Console, one of these. The assumption here is that you're using Google Chrome. It's going to be a little different for every other browser. The experience will be different. I recommend that you follow along with Chrome if you can. So you'll notice that I opened up the browser here, the inspector. It's printing out hello world because of JavaScript. We can look at network. This is what's going to be important. I'm going to refresh. And you can see that it loaded based on a network request, localhost, styles.css, and JavaScript. Each one of them, they're very small because we don't have a whole lot inside of our files, but there is a file size associated to them, and there is a time that it took to make that request. Now, if you're hosting it, maybe your hosting server is slow, maybe the network connection is poor, these times could be significantly larger, especially if your file size is larger. And let's go ahead and add the index.html extension because it's going to be important when it comes to our example. So that way, instead of retrieving localhost, we're actually getting that HTML file. If we wanted to, we could also go to the audit tab, so audits, and we can run an audit. It'll be quick because we don't have much going on here, but this is when it comes to PWA. So you can see that it doesn't recognize us as a qualified progressive web application. I can click it. A lot of these won't apply towards this particular tutorial. It's out of the scope, but this one right here, the page doesn't respond with 200 when offline because we don't have any caching strategy in place through a service worker. Now, this other stuff, such as the manifest, that includes like icons, theming colors like that. We're not going to worry about this for this tutorial. If you want a 100% supported PWA, you'll follow everything on this list. But for our sake, we're going to worry about the caching aspect of things. So we don't want to have to make these requests every time. So let's get into Workbox. So this is the core material of this particular video. So let's go back into our code editor. What we want to do is, actually I can just open up my terminal here. I'm going to touch another file. I'm going to create another file. I'm going to call it SW, which stands for service worker. I'm going to say serviceworker.js. I can bring back my Explorer, open up this service worker file. Let's go ahead and close the Explorer. And we can start designing that service worker based on Workbox. Like I said, I've tried doing vanilla service workers with the very basic APIs that the web browsers offer. The APIs aren't difficult. It's actually the whole strategy behind it and making sure that you're doing it effectively is the difficult part. So let's go back into our web browser. I'm going to go to this Workbox page. There's actually instructions if you click on the guides to get started. What's interesting to us is this URL right here because we want to add the import scripts. So if we copy that line and we paste it in the serviceworker.js file, so sw.js, then we can actually make use of Workbox. So let's go ahead and let's go ahead and try it. So we're going to say, let's start with the following. Let's say workbox.routing.register route. And this is all part of the documentation as well. If we went back, we can actually look through this documentation. In fact, it's even on the first page as well. It's very descriptive documentation, but there is some parts to be desired. So let's just walk through it. So we have register route. This register route takes a regular expression to determine what would trigger this particular route. So let's go ahead and do the following. Let's go ahead and say that this is going to be triggered based on CSS extensions or JavaScript extensions. And I am definitely not a regular expression expert, so I know that you can get a lot more complex than this, but this is a very basic check to say what is the file extension, and if it's matching CSS or JavaScript, then this is the route for us. So if it hits on that, we're going to say new workbox dot strategies dot stale while revalidate. So there are numerous strategies that you can use. There's the two that I use the most personally is stale while revalidate, and then cache first. There are a whole lot of others. There's some network first. There's other things as well. The stale while revalidate says that, you know what, when we first request this resource, we're always going to request it. We're always going to request the CSS and JavaScript files. After we request it, we're going to add it to cache. And we're going to do that every time. We're always going to read the most recent resource. But if a network connection doesn't exist, then we are going to use the cache. So if the network connection doesn't exist, we can't get the latest resource, so we're going to fall back to the cache. That's what this is saying. But we're always going to update that cache on every request as long as it's possible. So stale while revalidate, what we're going to say is we're going to name this cache store. We're going to say cache name. Let's just call it assets. You can say something like CSS, JavaScript. You can name it whatever makes the most sense to you. This is how it's stored in the web browser. We're going to say plugins, and we're going to define maybe an expiration plugin. So we're going to say new workbox.expiration.plugin. There's other plugins that you can choose from. Expiration is one that I use frequently. We're going to say new workbox.expiration. Actually, I just wrote that. I'm not paying attention here. We're going to say max entries. We're going to say maybe there's 1,000 max entries. And then we're going to give it a long time in seconds before it expires. You could do some kind of math. Let's just go ahead and say max age seconds. I believe this is like 1 year, so 315,636, and then maybe 3 or 4 zeros. Just know that this is some long time in seconds. You can expire it after maybe 7 days, an hour, whatever you want. If we really wanted to, we could say expire it in 30 minutes. I think 1800 seconds is 30 minutes. Do some math. Definitely don't try to freestyle it like I'm doing. But this is what we're saying is we're saying that it's going to expire no matter what. So if the internet connection doesn't exist, just go ahead and expire it. Because maybe we don't want to keep cache storage lingering around. Maybe we want to free up space after a certain amount of time. We're gonna set an expiration, and we don't have to. We certainly don't have to provide a cache name. We don't have to provide the plugins. Stale while revalidate will be enough for us. That's perfectly fine. So let's go ahead and add another route. Let's check it out again. Let's go ahead and copy this so that way it saves us a little bit of typing. We're going to make some changes here. So we're going to register the route. This time around, maybe, and I know that we don't have it in our project, but a good example of this may be images. So PNG, JPG, GIF, things like that. And there's plenty of other image formats as well. But maybe we want to use the cache first strategy. So in the cache first strategy, and first of all, let's change that cache name. Let's go ahead and set it maybe images, give it a different name. The reason behind the cache first is, you know what, your images, they probably aren't going to change very frequently. The need to have to revalidate those images on every request, probably a waste of time. I'd be surprised if your images change more frequently than 30 days at a time. In fact, on my own personal sites, I usually set them to a year in terms of expiration. It's totally up to you. But this is an example of where cache first might make sense. So I'm going to save it. Now, we do have a very appropriate Workbox service worker. The thing is, it's not wired up yet, so it's not being used in our project. It exists, it's just not being used. So we need to register it. So we can go back into index.html. Let's go ahead and add another script, and we could have easily done this in the scripts.js file, but we're gonna keep it separated. So what we're gonna say is we're gonna say script, and we're gonna add some simple JavaScript. So the first step is we need to check to see if service workers are allowed in this particular web browser. even though that support is pretty available for service workers. Some web browsers may not support them yet, or maybe it's not enabled. Let's go ahead and say service worker in Navigator. And this code is actually, you can pull it right off of the Workbox site as well. It's pretty common when it comes to service workers, but we're checking to see if it's available. If yes, we're going to say window.add event listener. So when the window loads, we're going to register that service worker. So we're going to say something along the lines of navigator.serviceworker.register. We're going to register sw.js because that's the file that we're using. This is a promise, so we're going to say then, and we're going to say maybe service worker reg. And upon a successful registration, we could print out a message saying maybe console.log worker registered. If not, maybe we want to catch it, so we can say catch. Maybe we say error. And we can say something like console.log. We can say there was an error, and maybe print out whatever that error was. And this should work. If I refresh the page, we're still serving with Python, as you can see in my window below. Let's go ahead and refresh that page. I'm going to go back into the website here. I'm going to refresh. First of all, let's see if there's any errors here. So it says worker registered. I can refresh again. Because now the page it's kind of following what that service worker set out to do. You can see that it printed stuff out. This is only on localhost. You won't get these debug logs in production. Let's go back into the network tab here. I'm going to refresh. You'll notice that styles and scripts are now loaded via the service worker. The time, it still takes time, but they're not requested from the internet. They're requested from the cache. And if you go into application, you can go to the cache storage. You can see that we have assets, because remember, we had set up assets. We don't have any images because of our application, but if we did, there would be images here as well. But you can see that scripts and styles are stored in the cache. And if I went to network, they are being loaded from the service worker. Index is not. We didn't set it up to store HTML files inside of the cache, but we could. 21 milliseconds, 23 milliseconds, kind of a long time. I think it was quicker just to pull it from the internet. But you have to imagine some things. If the files are large, maybe these are image files, maybe they're complex JavaScript or CSS, it's going to take a lot longer to pull those from the web, especially on a mobile device. So progressive web application, you want the mobile experience. You don't want them to take a long time. You want the experience to be fast and fluid. And this is where service workers and caching really helps with that effort. So let's go ahead and look at audit maybe. We can run another audit. I'll clear the old one. Let's go ahead and run it again, see if anything changed. We can click on progressive web app. Current page doesn't respond when it's offline. That's because HTML, we didn't add HTML yet. So we'll revisit this. So now the next stage. So if we go back into our code, we have everything caching at runtime based on the service worker. What if we wanted to cache a lot of things up front? We could do a precache strategy. So we can use Workbox build. So we can build a precache strategy. We can even build this service worker file for all of these runtime strategies. And we can actually do that with Node.JS. If you've been following along with the blog over time, you'll remember I did something with Gulp because I use Hugo for my own website, the Polyglot Developer. It doesn't really matter what you do. Workbox will work regardless, but we're actually going to precache with just simple Node.js, and we're also going to cache that HTML file. So let's go ahead and create another file in our project. Let's go ahead and say touch generator.js. Could be called whatever you want. It's not actually part of our application. It's part of our development process. What we're also going to do is, because we're building it, this is a build time kind of process, we're now going to initialize our project for Node.js. So we're going to say npm init -y, and we're going to install Workbox build. So we're going to say npm install workbox build -- save dev. All right, so that's good to go. I'm going to open up my Explorer real quick. I'm going to open up my generator.js file. You'll notice that I do have a node modules directory and also some package.json files. Those are all part of the build scripts. So I'm going to hide the Explorer, and I'm going to say constant workbox equals require workbox build. And now we're going to generate a service worker file. So we're going to say workbox.generate SW, and we're going to define the configuration. So the configuration, it's a lot more involved, but everything is described on the Workbox website. So again, this is a very valuable website to go to. This is part of the Google Web Tools. So let's go ahead and start defining those. So first up, let's define a cache ID. So let's just say maybe this is PWA example for like our example project. You can name it whatever you want. This is kind of a root kind of storage for our cache. We can still individually name each of our runtime caches, but this is kind of a global kind of parent level application cache. We're going to find the directory of where to look for our files, kind of where to start. So we're going to say glob directory. And this is going to be the relative local path right here, the directory that we're already in. We're going to define the things that we want to pre-cache. So these are the files that we want to cache up front. So we're going to say glob patterns, and this is an array. And you can put in some wildcards in there as well. This is what we're going to do. So we're going to say look in every directory, look at every file, as long as it's a CSS or JavaScript file. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to pre-cache all JavaScript and all CSS. We're not going to add anything else. Next up, we're going to define an output directory. So we're going to define swdest. It's going to be in our current path. We're going to say sw.js, so we're just going to name it the same as the service worker file that we had previously created. And we're going to define our runtime configuration caching. So we're going to say runtime caching, and this is going to look fairly familiar. This is probably going to be the most familiar part versus what we had previously done. So let's go ahead and define a rule. So we're going to say URL pattern. We're going to provide our regex, so we're going to say something like this. This time around, we're going to say HTML. I think people still use HTM, although I don't see it as much that anymore. Maybe XML, because that's a markup language as well. You can really add whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. Whatever makes sense to you. We're going to say what kind of handler this is. So this is going to be a stale while revalidate. So it should look familiar. And then we're going to define the options that go with it. So the plugin kind of things. So the expirations. We're going to say cache name. This time around, I'm going to call it markup. I'm going to set an expiration. The expiration is going to be something small again. Max age seconds. Again, I think that's 30 minutes. Bust out a calculator, do some math, figure out what makes sense to you. Markup, stale while revalidate. Remember, it's going to download the latest copy every time. It's just going to store it in cache up until the expiration time. So let's go ahead and save it. Let's go ahead and try to run it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, and I'll actually use this terminal down here. I'll stop my Python. I'm going to say node generator.js. See if it runs. Looks like it failed in some fashion. Did I spell runtime caching wrong? Option is not a supported parameter. Oh, it should be plural. So let's go ahead and save it. So options, not option. Run it again. Didn't error out this time. I'll look at my service worker file. You can see that it's a little different now because this is auto-generated. It still has the import scripts. It still has a lot of familiar pieces, some new. It still has our register route. It doesn't look like it pre-cached any of our JavaScript or CSS. So let's revisit on why that could be. Let's go to generator. Actually, instead of the pipe this time around, it should be a comma, I think. So let's go ahead and run it again. Let's look at the service worker. You can see that it cached a few things. So it cached our scripts like it should, cached our styles. It also cached generator, which we're going to fix in a second. These are pre-cache, remember. It also has a revision. So anytime any of those files change, the revision is going to change. So that way it re-caches. So that way it doesn't use the old cache when our pre-cache items change. It just updates it. So that way it adds it to the cache again. So let's fix this. We probably don't want generator in our final project. So what we can do is we can actually add ignores. So let's go ahead and add maybe ignore, glob ignores. This is an array. And similar to the glob that we have on the previous line, we could say something like, what do we have? We have generator.js. We probably don't want to cache that serviceworker.js file just in case. And you know what? We have a node modules directory. We probably don't want to cache that either. So we can say node modules, and we're going to say don't cache any subdirectories, don't cache any files. So I'm going to save it. I'm going to run it again. And I'm going to go to the service worker file, and you can see that it removed it this time. So it only has the two files that we wanted. It also has that strategy for markup. And if I wanted to, I can go back into running it. So I can say Python M simple HTTP server port 8001. Go to my web browser here. I'm going to go back to network. See what's going on here. So we can go to application. We could actually manually restart this service worker. We can update it if we wanted to. So let's skip waiting. There's actually a command that you can use as part of Workbox build if you want to have it update on refresh, which in a lot of circumstances you might want to do that. Otherwise it'll update when they close the tab and revisit your website. Let's go back to network, refresh, index. It looks like it's part of the service worker. I can go to the application. You can see that I have a markup cache now. It has HTML in it. I still have assets. I have the precache, which is the JavaScript and CSS. Assets is no longer being used, but this precache is. So very interesting stuff that you can do here. And as you can see, if I went offline, this in theory would still work. And that's the beauty of having a progressive web application is it functions like an application. It's an offline first application. There's plenty of circumstances why this would be good. But then again, even if you weren't looking at it from the progressive web application perspective, when it comes to user experience and performance, having a cache is great. And service workers makes that very possible. And like I said, I mean, you can play around with service workers manually if you want. I definitely recommend using Workbox. It's kind of the recommended approach. Makes life a lot easier, especially when it comes to figuring out when should your service workers update, how do you clear out the cache, things like that. So this is a video tutorial on how to use Workbox, how to use service workers, how you get to that caching level.